Fifthly, it is objected that a national provision for religion is inconsistent with justice, the rights of conscience, and private judgment. That it is unjust because it is the employment of national funds in which all have a common right to support a church of which all are not members, and in which all have not a common interest. It must be admitted on both sides of this subject that national resources are to be applied to national purposes, and to such purposes as may promote the national welfare, and that every application productive of national happiness is legitimate. Who determines the application of the national revenue? The nation, the nation through the medium of its representatives, or a minority? If a nation, acting on the Christian principle of representation, devotes part of its wealth to the support of religion, is it an act of injustice? To whom? It cannot be an act of injustice to the nation, because it is a nation's own act, done for its own advantage, and for the purpose of promoting its own happiness and prosperity. Unjust to the minority, is it? That cannot be unjust to a minority, which upon the whole advances the interests and increases the happiness of the greater number. It is an admitted principle in civil governments where representation prevails, that the greatest amount of good to the greatest number is not only desirable, but the only righteous policy which a government should pursue. Dismiss the principle and act on that of the objection, and the greatest good to the greatest number is sacrificed to the will, and it may be to the ignorant caprice of the few. To the few also is sacrificed the fundamental principle of representative government. The majority of a nation, I admit, may do wrong, as too often they do, but this is not applicable to the view now stated, because the condition of my argument is that the greatest good to the greatest number is produced, and that, when properly understood, will be admitted as right. But what right, it may be asked in the spirit of the objection, has a majority of the nation to make such provision for religion? Simply, I answer, on the ground that a national provision will be productive of greater good to the nation than if no such provision was made, and that precisely as is done in all other cases of government. National policy, where even vast sums of money are expended, do not always, and perhaps never receive, the approbation of the whole community. Were the objection now under consideration valid, citizens opposed to such policy would have the same right to complain of injustice, because that part of the national wealth represented by them is employed to carry on a system of which they disapprove. It is a question of justice as to the approbation of money, and if it is unjust to use national resources to support a religious system which promotes the happiness of the nation, then also is it unjust to use the national resources for the support of a war, however just, because some are opposed to it. The same objection might be made against every approbation of money. Against every appropriation of money. There is no difference in principle whether the money is applied to the support of religion or to some civil purpose. Is the appropriation to promote the welfare and good of the people? Then every objection must yield. The objection proceeds on a fallacy. The resources of a nation are national prosperity, and no one has a personal or individual interest in them. They are the property of the whole and to be employed for the good of the whole. In the second part of the objection, it is said that a national provision for religion violates conscience and the rights of private judgment. It would be difficult to understand how it could interfere with conscience or private judgment, unless it is made compulsory upon every one to be a member of the church or to wait on its ministrations. It is conceivable that an oppressive and persecuting government might do something of this kind, or a tax might be imposed for the purpose of maintaining a particular system of religion, and the payment of the tax is avowedly made in acknowledgment of the religious principles taught. In such cases, then, indeed, violence would be done to conscience and private judgment. But providing for a national support of religion does not any of these. It leaves private judgment as free as God has made it. Individuals may nevertheless entertain such views of religious doctrine as seem to them agreeable to the Word of God, and responsible only to Him for their belief. The rights of conscience are still preserved. No one is compelled to accept of religious ministrations inconsistent with his sense of right, or give his assent to religious principles which he conscientiously believes to be wrong. The public faith may be correct, and he may act a very sinful part in not approving of it. Still, it could be wrong to compel him to acknowledge and profess it. For his religious belief, so long as he does not injure society by expressing and propagating it, he is responsible to God alone. But while it would justly be styled persecution to compel men to profess and submit to what they did not believe, Yet there is no persecution, no infringement of private judgment or rights of conscience to apply any part of the public property for the support of a particular faith, though there may be a minority who do not approve of that faith. Quakers and peacemen believe that it is wrong to wage war. It is part of the religious belief of the former, but it is ever esteemed a violation of their private judgments or of their consciences for a nation of which they are a part to declare war. They may lay their views before the public, but if the nation act otherwise, or they persecuted or in any way personally wronged, the cases are perfectly parallel. No objection can be urged against the former on the ground of conscience that might not with equal propriety be urged against the latter. Yet no one supposes that violence is done to the consciences of Quakers, though a government may find it necessary to maintain a lawful war. Sixthly, it is said to encroach on the prerogatives of the head of the church and upon her independence. In Erastian establishments of religion, it is admitted that the prerogatives of the mediator and the spiritual independence of the church have been encroached on. Over such cases, every friend of Zion should bewail, and all righteous means should be employed to reform them, or, if incapable of reformation, to destroy them. But the assumption of spiritual power over the church by Erastian civil rulers is no part of a national provision for religion, as well might it be said that tyranny is part of the provision made for the national administration of justice. Sometimes civil rulers, while furnishing the means of a national support for religion, have assumed a power over the church in spiritual matters, and have most audaciously claimed to be visible heads of the church and robbed her of her spiritual independence. Civil rulers have sometimes, too, made the tribunals of justice engines of oppression. But does the establishment of a national judiciary necessarily include the idea of oppression by the executive? Nor does a national provision for religion necessarily involve Erastianism. That they have been sometimes associated is no proof that they are inseparable. Let it even be admitted that they have never as yet been separated, which would be far from the truth. Still, this would not prove the necessary connection between them. But we can not only conceive of their being distinct, we have at least one example of a national provision for religion where there were no Erastian encroachment on the head of the church, nor on her independence. The church during a former dispensation had a national provision, but there was no union of church and state, no Erastian blending of the civil and religious things together. Yet there was a friendly alliance constituted by divine authority. In spiritual matters, the church was dependent only on her head, the Lord Jesus Christ. Her authority in these was absolutely independent of all civil power. The civil power had indeed a care respecting the church, but it was not a spiritual power. It was civil, a power to protect the members of the church from external aggression in their enjoyment of their religious rights. This the church could not do, for she had no civil authority, and it was a power of furnishing pecuniary means for maintaining the worship of God and supporting its ministers. I plead not for a union of church and state, nor for a blending of them in any way, which the objection takes for granted as inseparable from a national provision for religion. But I hold it to be the duty of a nation, without in any way interfering with spiritual matters, to provide for the worship of the true God. Number 6. A national provision for the support of religion is necessary. There is a vast difference between the felt necessity of temporal and spiritual things. The former are strongly and vividly, the latter are generally but inadequately felt. Men have in most instances sufficient stimulus to excite them to provide their bodily wants. On the other hand, there is little or none to excite them to provide for their spiritual necessities. And often the very principles of our nature which excite attention to the former become means of withdrawing the attention from the latter. The instinctive principles of self-preservation urge man to seek food and raiment and suitable lodgings for his body, but these do not move him to use property if he has acquired it for the purpose of obtaining spiritual instruction for his mind and for the convenient worship of the true God. Pride, vanity, and ambition all combine to excite men to strive for their indulgence and gratification. But at the same time they deaden the mind and tend to make it, and still more, indifferent in respect of spiritual things. And even when conscience or fear are excited by the undefined anticipations of the future, they brood over the naturally corrupt minds of men, they always reject the truths of the gospel, and stay themselves in the deceitful props of superstition, so that false religion only is received. Quote, because, says the apostle, the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned." Unquote. Romans 8, verse 7, and 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14. To leave religion to be sought for by the mere promptings of the sense of spiritual want is to leave it to a principle which universal experience, as well as testimony of the Spirit of God, assures us can neither point out the thing needed, nor in the least induce to seek its enjoyments, but on the contrary repels and drives the natural mind farther away from it. In these circumstances, it is not to be expected that men will spontaneously provide for wants which they do not feel, and which, if either experience or testimony of the Spirit of God is relied on for information, they cannot feel, and that for the satisfactory reason that they have no sense of such wants. In cities as well as frequently in rural districts, but especially in the crowded population of the former, there are vast numbers who know as little and care as little for the worship of the true God, who have as little regard to spiritual happiness, present or future, as the untutored savage that roams through the desert, or the civilized, though on this subject equally ignorant and idolatrous Hindu. Without God and without hope in the world, it is supposable, in despite of all experience, and of what is infinitely better authority, in despite of the voice of God speaking from heaven, that in such circumstances men will provide themselves with the means of religion? Can the tenants of the tomb join in sympathy with the grief of friends they have left behind? Can the Ethiopian change the color of his skin, or the leopard his spots? Then may we expect that men sunk in ignorance and sin will spontaneously provide themselves with religious instruction, but not till then. The truth is, all who have given much attention to the subject know that it is remarkably difficult to keep up sufficient interest in the minds even of the great bulk of professors of religion. The almost universal preference that is given to the wants of the body to the spiritual wants of the soul, nay, that the means of ministering to luxury and mere animal indulgence is secured, while the support of the gospel occupies only a secondary place, that the latter is always made to yield to the former. Is it Christian-like? Is it even philosophical, with all these facts before us, to maintain that provision for religion may be safely left to the spontaneous demands of men for the enjoyment of religious privileges like the demands for his bodily wants? It is useless, worse than useless, because it is deceptive, to reply to the argument by saying, as is generally done, that the gospel found its way into the nations and flourished for ages without any public provision, even in spite of national hostility, and broke down the barriers of idolatry, and what God has done may and will do again. He may and will do again, The comparison fails. The reply, therefore, is irrelevant. When the gospel was first promulgated, the nations were heathen. All national provision was, of course, out of question till these nations were made acquainted with it and taught to submit to its doctrines. Can it be sustained as a fair argument that because heathen nations did not make provision for the support of the gospel, nations enjoying the light of Christian truth ought not? Or is it fair to reason from what God did in an extraordinary case that he will do the like in ordinary cases, carry out the principle in its legitimate bearings, and its folly and falseness will at once become apparent? In the first ages of Christianity, its apostles and ministers were endowed with the supernatural power of working miracles. The exercise of this power must have excited an attention to the truths of Christianity, and of course a corresponding anxiety on the part of those so excited to enjoy its ministrations. That will be in vain looked for in the ordinary course of things. The apostles were illiterate, but they received the gift of tongues. They were supernaturally and instantly taught a variety of languages. It is reasonable to conclude from this that the ministers of religion ought still to be taken from among Is it reasonable to conclude from this that the ministers of religion ought still to be taken from among the illiterate and confide on the gifts of tongues supernaturally communicated to qualify them for their labors? God sent an angel and delivered Paul from prison. Does any Christian now expect any extraordinary interposition on his behalf? God sent his angel and signified to John the things that would be. Does any Christian expect that John will make a revelation of the future to him, as he did to John?